Waking up is a very personal moment in every person's daily life. That is why most people prefer to wake up in a safe and secure place, best of all, in their own bed. However, for some people, it is not a rule but rather a privilege, especially for people in my line of work. But that doesn't mean I don't like it. And I certainly don't like waking up bound hand and foot in power shackles, like a prize pig at a farm show, before becoming the centerpiece of a gala dinner. And with all of this happening aboard an old demilitarized Eulerian ship waiting to be scrapped at the New Hope shipyards, the level of service satisfaction on my mental scale definitely doesn't deserve even 1 star. The impressively sized army boots that were the first thing I saw upon opening my eyes were the final touch that allowed me to form my morning greeting. "What the hell?" I asked, turning onto my back and trying to sit up. My words elicited a lively reaction. I was swept up under my restrained arms behind my back, lifted up and placed in something that had been a chair a couple of centuries ago. A man of stout build with graying, short-cropped hair came into view in front of me. He looked about 40 years old. With all the modern medical advances, he could have been about 50, but he was actually 63. I knew who it was. "What the hell, Terran?" I repeated my greeting. Terrence Collier, a businessman, benefactor, philanthropist, smuggler, and conman, sat down on the gutted hull of the console across from me. Behind me, the owner of the army boots was breathing meaningfully. I wouldn't have been surprised if he had been holding me continuously in the crosshairs of some huge macho bazooka, but I didn't turn around. People like that don't like sudden movements. "There are 2 kinds of men, Val," Terran said. "Those who sit in shackles and those who ask questions. You're shackled." I squirmed in my chair. Theoretically, I could jump up and try to hit him, but it was a long shot. "I just want to talk, Val." "That's your problem," I said. "As for me, I don't even want to smell you, let alone do some chit-chat. It stinks too much." "With what? Problems?" Terran asked. "With you. Cut the crap, Terran. What do you want? What's all this drama for?" Terran was staring at my face. The bastard obviously knew I hated being stared at. However, as I intercepted his gaze, I suddenly realized there was more behind it than just a desire to annoy me. Actually, Terran didn't have to be personally involved in causing people trouble, especially if it was someone as insignificant as me on the receiving end. Yes, I'm one of the best. And yes, I have an excellent reputation. But that's only for those in the know, and there aren't very many of them. Guys like me don't appear on federal news channels, and they don't do Saturday evening shows. Terran could swat me away like a fly with one hand if he wanted to. Just send a dozen or 2 of competent professionals, and no one will ever see me again. After all, he did manage to sneak me out of my own apartment without a hitch, so he must want something. "I have a job for you," Terran said. "I already have a job," I answered, almost without a twist of the tongue. The only thing I had left to do right now was to fill one small order, just to get some documents from point A to point B. I was just thinking about how I could better begin to fulfill it. Well, what bloody difference does it make now? I didn't even have time to get ready. Things took an unexpected turn, and here I am, tied up in an old decommissioned boat. So that will leave the planetary IRS without that informant tip. Open check, Terran said. You decide how much you want. That was interesting. I'd only ever heard about one such offer. It wasn't made for me, though, and thank God for that. It ended very badly. Open checks are only offered when you don't expect to have to pay, or when things are bad enough to make you desperate. I looked at Terran. Shackles, I said. Then we'll talk. The army boots behind my back snuffled noisily. Terran looked over my head, apparently silently communicating with his thug. People like him often develop this method of communication with subordinates, especially with those subordinates who, by the law of balance, didn't have enough room for brains after their fists. Take it off, Terran said. Look, I'm not sure, said the boots in an unexpectedly ordinary voice you might hear from a bank clerk or petty official. I expected to hear something more dramatic, some harsh, hoarse growl or sneaky discount, but the voice fell out of the scenery. Have you seen his face? He's one of those. I hate traitors. Take it off, Terran repeated. I'm not gonna kiss him. Val is a reasonable guy. He's not gonna do some fancy tricks. You wouldn't, would you, Val? I shrugged. With my hands cuffed behind my back, it looked like I was scratching my tailbone. Well, I warned you, the boot said, and the seconds later the invisible shackles were gone from my arms and legs. The only good thing about power shackles is that if you don't try anything, they don't tighten and dig into your skin and flesh like the steel shackles do. Unless the person who puts them on presses one little button on the control panel. Now that's different, I said, rubbing my wrist involuntarily. There was nothing wrong with my hands, of course, just a reflex. So, what's your problem, Terran? Lost some ship with a big load of fresh dope? Or is the competition closing in on you? You know, I don't do hit jobs. You've got enough of your own muscle for that. I wouldn't be surprised if I got a kick in the head from an army boot, or Terran ordered me to be thrown out of the airlock after those words. But this time, Terran managed to really surprise me. The underground king rubbed his forehead tiredly and sighed, and when he looked at me again, there were tears in his eyes. My daughter is missing, he said. I want you to find her. 18 planets and stations, and 3 months later, we finally managed to find something. Yes, we. Because it was almost the first time I wasn't working on a case alone. Terran insisted, and I finally agreed. It's not every day you get a chance to work with an open check, even if the case seems hopeless at first glance. Terran's presence on board ended up being almost helpful. He may not have been able to show his face in most places where he'd been, but his name and money opened a few doors that I wouldn't otherwise have been allowed to come even within a light year's distance. Couldn't say the same about Zung. I don't know if it was his first name, last, or the street handle. Just Zung. The one with the army boots, who hated traitors, wasn't sure, and warned the boss about me. A big burly guy, a head taller than me, filled with steroids, who had the face of a man you want to stay away from. Terran only addressed him as Zung, and I had no desire to get to know him better, especially after he told me at the first opportunity when Terran wasn't present. "I've got you covered, pal. Don't you try any tricks on me. I'll make it quick but painful, like with all traitors." I looked him calmly in the eye. After a dozen seconds, he couldn't take it anymore and turned away. Yeah, the left side of my face makes an impression, even on guys like Zung, with testosterone tanks for brains. That's probably why he hated me. One thing I was 100% sure of. Despite his age, Zung had no more to do with the army or navy during the war than my great-grandmother's old cat. So, PTSD and other veteran stuff had nothing to do with his tricks. For some reason, these guys, who spent their best years in far from ideal places, behind bars, really like to flaunt their patriotism. Especially now, when the war was long ago ended, with us humans as the winning side. "Just keep in mind," he hissed at me as I turned to leave, but the effect was already ruined. I did keep that in mind. It was clear that sooner or later Zung was going to be one of those problems that couldn't be avoided. Otherwise, they'll drop on you real big. When Terran explained the problem to me, it sounded so ridiculous that I didn't even believe it at first. "I can't work without knowing all the details," I told him. "You're holding something back, and there is no way I can help unless you're level with me. I can't believe you didn't stash that information somewhere else." Terran was already looking all like his regular mean, gritty version. The desperate father was tucked deep under the armor of equanimity. "If I still had that data, why would I turn to you?" Terran was in the co-pilot's chair. Not that I ever needed a co-pilot. I always work alone. I was actually expecting some issues from Terran regarding his accommodation. After all, I only have a decommissioned military courier, not a luxury yacht. Surprisingly, if anyone squeaked a couple of times about the small cabin and questionable food, it was Zung. But he shut up after a brief conversation with Terran. Terran was rumored to be from the pre-war slums on New Hope, even before the planet became an industrial center. So he'd probably seen places much worse than my ship. "I don't think we need this loser right now," said Zong. The deckhouse had only 2 chairs, so the big guy had to stand behind us. We didn't need him here, as he was no help except for a nuisance, but Zung thought it was his duty to keep his guard up. "My men could have handled it on their own. Boss, I think—" "How many times have I told you to quit that habit?" Terran interrupted him. "Thinking is not your thing. When you're thinking, everything else starts to go wrong. Leave it to me." Good thing I had my back to Zung. I didn't want to add to our beautiful relationship with my gloating grin. "I warned you," Zung mumbled a little offhandedly, but didn't elaborate. Terran turned to me again. "I wasn't doing any business there. It was more like—" He paused. "Let's just say it was a personal residence. A place where I and my loved ones could retreat from everything. A whole planet to have fun on," I sighed. "There are rich people, and there are those for whom money has long since lost all meaning. But I had never heard of anyone getting a whole planet for their own use without anyone ever hearing about it." "The war was coming to an end," Terran said. "There was chaos and devastation everywhere. People were chasing spies and traitors, fictional and real, and sometimes Eulerian raiders would pop up out of nowhere. So when I got my hands on those coordinates, I saved them for personal use. Maybe. The galaxy is huge. There are hundreds of thousands of times more star systems and even habitable planets than we need and know about. Although, of course, the local sector is explored better. I suspected that as soon as Terran got his hands on them, these coordinates mysteriously disappeared from the official databases as well. Just as they had now disappeared from Terran's own databases. The coordinates of each object in the galaxy necessary to calculate a hyperjump to it are not just latitude and longitude, like on naval map. It's a cumbersome pile of numbers and letters written in a specific sequence. In printed form, it's about a page of ugly mathematical gibberish. No normal person learns it by heart. That's what the navigation computer database on the ship, or station, or planet is for. Of course, for most objects, all this data is duplicated and cross-referenced in myriad ways. But, as it turns out, not for all of them. And it turns out that, without these coordinates, it is almost impossible to find the desired planet or station among a vast number of stars. I thought that with all our science, with all our technical prowess, which allowed us to master a large chunk of the galaxy, and even to win the most terrible war that mankind had ever known in its history, we still looked like prehistoric people floating on a raft across the ocean. Once the fog hides the sky, we lose the ability to determine where we are and where we should be headed. Fog. That's a good metaphor. The fog of war. Terran was right. In his great world, everything is built on respect and authority. If competitors find out that the impregnable and powerful head of the Scollier clan is rushing around the galaxy in search of either runaway or a kidnapped small girl, minds will start to churn and ferment. Though you can't really call her small, I thought. 24 years old, only in comparison to me, a hardened relic of the war. And Terran himself, of course. Neyetta Scollier, 24 years old, had vanished without a trace 3 weeks ago. No notes, no demands from the kidnappers, nothing at all. Terran was convinced she was kidnapped and forced to copy the planet's coordinates and then delete them. Not sure in which exact order. Terran said he'd hired the best computer systems experts, and they assured him there was no way to recover the data. Everything was cleaned up. It was disconcerting that we found absolutely nothing, even after scouring the criminal underbelly of Tlap and many other planets and stations. It was strange. It doesn't work that way. No action happens in the vacuum. Everything leaves traces that ripple outwards, especially in a sensitive environment like people, who reside where the harsh hand of the law either barely reaches or doesn't reach at all. Terran assumed that the key to everything was the planet itself, and that it was the planet to look for. Since there were no other clues, that's what we did. And we hit a dead end. It seemed that not a single living soul on the Kshadra planets, or within the Federation, even knew of the hidden planet's existence. So, we had to look outside the Federation. And at the first Eulerian station, I found something. Of course, Zung didn't want me to go there alone. He'd defect in a heartbeat and sell us with our guts. Given the questionable gastronomic preferences of the Eularians during the war, Zung's statement sounded particularly nauseating. You can't trust a traitor. I told you, they won't talk to... I started to say in a tired voice, but Terran gestured me to stop. Shut your goddamn trap, he said to Zung. He'll go alone. And Zung backed out. In fact, I wasn't sure that my biography, so colorfully imprinted on my face, would count as plus in the eyes of the locals. But I was lucky. I didn't get shot right at the entrance and thrown out of the airlock without a word. The veterans who lived on the station must have wondered what this human with the sign of allegiance on his face needed so badly that he risked showing up uninvited. They talked to me. During the whole conversation, I felt like I was an amusing pet whose owner was having an amiable conversation with, like a man with a purring kitten. Humiliation is the usual price to pay to get information from the Eularians. Another reason why neither Terran nor Zung should have been allowed on the station. Those two were only willing to trade humiliation on their own terms. I found out something, I said as we pulled away from the station. They told me quite a bit that should interest you, and one or two things that interested me. Terran was still trying to look like a granite statue of himself, but he was getting worse at that. It's common for tough guys to be the worst at dealing with mental distress. Some of his despair had obviously gotten to Zung. In the red brain of the thug, it was transformed in the usual way, into desire to slit my throat. But that didn't bother me too much. Terran had him on a short leash. Such as? Terran stared at me. I touched the left side of my face. It's a stupid habit, but every time I talk to the Eularians, it pops up. I've got data on the area where the planet we're interested in might be located. That's your bit. Terran frowned. Keep talking. They also mentioned about certain spaceships that just happened to disappear in that area at the end of the war. That's my bit. I watched Terran very closely, but not a muscle on his face flinched. Is it relevant? He asked. I shrugged. I don't know. Do you? Terran was silent for a while, ignoring Zung's fierce sniffling. The thug was trying his best to poke holes in me with his eyes. I paid you, Terran said at last. And I'll pay you more. You promised to do whatever it took to keep my daughter safe. And I will, I nodded. When I'm paid, I always follow the job through. An indicator on the console blinked, telling me that the coordinates from the memory crystal I'd brought from the station had been processed and the ship was ready to jump. If this is what rich people think of a planet for personal use, then it's a good thing I'll never be rich. But then again, what would I know about such things? Maybe if Terran signed over his entire fortune to me via open check, I might want to settle in a hole like that too. Well, it wasn't a meaningless piece of lifeless rock, of course. It even had an atmosphere and some life. Roughly on a Devonian Earth level. Ferns and frogs. And yet, it was still an empty and boring world. For people like Terran, however, privacy is probably the most important thing. It wasn't that hard to find. When you know the approximate search area of a dozen stars, You can figure out the jump coordinates for each one from indirect parameters. And once we were in the system, Terran had no trouble pointing out the planet in question. Third from the star, like 90% of the Earth-like worlds in the galaxy. "What's it called?" I asked Terran as we entered the orbit of a brown-blue spheroid shaggy with clouds. There was some green on it already, but not much. Terran shrugged. "Nothing. Why give a name to something no one but you knows about anyway?" I glanced at him. "Somebody knows now." Terran remained silent, his face instantly petrified. As we approached the planet, he became more and more withdrawn. So much so that I even began to worry a little. Zung, however, was doing work for both of them. Suspicion and resentment oozed out of him, almost becoming a tangible odor. Or maybe he really did stink. The ship's ion showers didn't work so well. Good thing he wasn't in the deckhouse right now. "Wait," Terran said suddenly, pointing to one of the view screens which now showed the cloud-free surface of the planet. "Over there." I played with the camera settings, zooming in on the area. On the border between the reddish-brown land with green patches and the blue ocean, I could clearly see some kind of artificial structure. "Is that your summer house?" I asked. Terran shook his head slowly. "No way, no," he said in a voice that had the feel of his long life, decades of dark deeds and scary decisions. "I have no idea what it is. Therefore, that's where we're going." I obeyed silently. There was no point in explaining anything. Terran would see for himself soon enough. But I recognized the structure at first sight. Surprisingly, the angular hulk of the temple, as far from natural forms and human aesthetics as possible, seemed entirely appropriate here, on the primitive shore of a wild planet. "What the—" Terran stared at the structure in amazement. Where did this come from? I took a few steps toward the narrow metal bridge from the high cliff to the temple, which rose straight out of the water. "How long ago you had visited this planet last time, Terran?" "About a year," he answered. It was obvious from the tycoon's face that he didn't understand anything. I sighed. "The Eularians can build very quickly if they need to. They usually deliver huge sections by large freighters at once. They even have temples standardized, the result of thousands of years of developing a paramilitary civilization." Terran's eyes became glassy. I was even afraid that he was about to go completely off the handle and throw himself off a cliff. Not that I would grieve for him so much, but he hadn't paid all due to me yet. "This is the Temple of the Discarnate," I said. Of course, temple isn't quite the right word, since discarnation isn't exactly a religion, but it's the closest term. The Eularians have erected them on many war-torn planets in the last 10 years. It's like monastery and a place of penance at the same time. "Eularians!" Terran grabbed me by the shoulder and yanked me toward him. "What are you talking about? What is this? And where is my daughter?" I didn't answer, as I was busy, keeping an eye on Zung. The thug had initially stayed with the ship, which I had landed about half a kilometer from the temple. However, there was someone else to help me with the answer. "Your daughter is in the temple," said a low, almost emotionless voice. "She's all right." Terran literally shoved me aside. It wasn't that he was so strong. It was more that I hadn't expected him to be so quick. Guess I'm getting too old for this. He had the sense not to lash out at the Eularian, though. I don't know if Terran knew the Eularian insignia, but I knew it very well. Judging by the ritual notches on the alien's cheekbones, we were talking to a former Special Forces officer, a stormtrooper, who'd been in at least 100 operations, if I remembered correctly the meaning of the notch above his left eye. "We didn't kidnap her," said the Eularian, dressed in the Eularian version of the monk's cassock, a rather shapeless garment of coarse cloth. "She approached us about a year ago with the coordinates of planet, and now she's decided to join us. Everyone has their own way." I have been completely ignored by the Eularian. Can't say I was too upset about that. The attention of Eularian stormtrooper is far from something to which one can aspire. In my long post-war career, and certainly during the war, I'd seen enough people with nothing to lose. Those who have crossed the point where they no longer care about anything, including their own death. Taking a step toward the Eularian, Terran looked exactly like that. I don't know how it would have ended for him if, a moment later, all hell had not broken loose around us. Usually, when people tell about such things, they try to sugarcoat their part to make themselves look like tough fighters. The good thing is that there are usually no witnesses around and no one to refute the boast. I'm either too indifferent or too old for that. Especially since I have nothing to embellish. I was lying quietly behind a large rock, trying not to catch an accidental charge from a pulse gun or plasma rifle. But I did get a glimpse of things going on around me. Zung had started firing from a distance, yelling furious nonsense about traitors, traps, and damned enemies. That's what got him killed. The Eularian stormtrooper quickly but carefully knocked Terran off his feet and took Zung down with the first shot of a pulse pistol, pulled from somewhere in the bowels of his brown robe. He dodged the thug's shots without the slightest effort. I knew that Eularian stormtroopers could instantly calculate the trajectory of a charge by the direction of the barrel a moment before it was fired, but it still looked spectacular. However, the next problem was already falling from the sky, almost on our heads. An unmarked small landing craft dropped just 20 steps from the bridge guardian. The boat's ramp swung open with the rumble, and people in combat suits spilled out of the ship's belly. I didn't have time to count them because at this moment, from behind the Eularian, 2 more of his tribesmen appeared. From this on, it seemed to me that the air itself was about to catch the flames from the gunfire. It was all over after about 30 seconds. I was surprised it had taken so long. "I thought the discarnates didn't resolve to guns or violence," I said, getting to my feet and trying not to look at what was left of Terran's goons. Eularian assault rifles are powerful things, and when they hit a human body, the results are usually ugly. "We're only novices," the Eularian said, holding out his hand to help me. It felt like hard wood, only warmer. I hadn't felt that in a long time. We hadn't gone through the full initiation yet. After Nieta applied to the order and word got out that you were flying here with her father, The local hierarchs decided to summon us and gave us a temporary reprieve. The two Eularians came up as well. Both were similarly veteran stormtroopers. One of them bent over the still-lying Terran. "Alive," he said briefly. Not in Eularian, obviously for my sake. I didn't bother to inform him that I spoke Eularian as well as he did. "Only fainted." "Bring him to his senses," said the Eularian who had spoken to me and turned to me again. "Your name is Vyacheslav Shamshurin." He pronounced my name almost effortlessly, more correctly than most people. "Yes, but I prefer to be called Val." "I've heard of you. Back during the misleading." That's what the discarnates called the war. Coming from an apparent war veteran, it sounded peculiar. "But I didn't know you wore the mark of allegiance." I didn't say anything. It was, as they say, written all over my face, literally. "We can remove it, you know," the Eularian said. "Not completely. A little scarring will left. But it won't be the mark anymore. We have good scientists. Probably the same ones who planted the parasites that disfigured my face," I thought. "And now they've bred new ones that will give it back to me?" "Thank you," I said. "I'll make do." He waited for a comment, but I remained silent. "Well, that's your way," the Eularian finally said. "You didn't add Chnaij," I pointed out. Chnaij in Eularian meant useless inferior creature to be exterminated. A standard Eularian reference to intelligent beings of any other species, before and during the war, and for many to this day. "We don't use that word here in the temple," the Eularian said. "But you were tempted to," I remarked. The Eularian blinked. It was as if the armored gates had momentarily covered the embrasures of the pillbox. It wasn't exactly a metaphor. Not every weapon could penetrate the Eularian's eyelids. "Old habits die hard," he said. But their benefit was rejected. I heard a noise behind me. "Traitor!" I turned around. Terran was trying to tear away from the grasp of the Eularian stormtrooper. Sorry, novice. It looked like an earthworm trying to break free of the hydraulic press that was crushing it. If Eularians were capable of outward displays of emotion, this one would look confused and embarrassed. "Are you talking to me, Terran?" I asked, approaching. "You sold me and Nieta to those things!" I sighed. "Before you kidnapped me, I didn't even know you had a daughter," I said. "But you should have thought twice before you hired me. You figured that I, because of my past—" I winked at him with my left eye from deep within the ghastly scars, "would be able to negotiate with the Eularians, who still had the planet's coordinates. After all, you bought it from them, didn't you?" Terran stopped tearing up, but his gaze went completely wild. "Those 8 ships that went missing around here somewhere, those were refugees, weren't they? Several large liners, packed full of people fleeing Eularian raids. People who paid everything they had to the men who managed to charter those liners. To you." I looked him straight in the eye, and this time Terran couldn't stand it and looked away. "And then you sold them to the Eularians. First you robbed them, and then you sold them. Replaced the tlap coordinates in their navigators with coordinates for another system. After the war, everyone wondered how a small-time smuggler like you suddenly came up with the money to build an underground empire. Need I remind you what that another system was, Terran? I glanced at the three Eulerians. They listened to my monologue in silence, and, as it seemed to me, with keen interest. There are two types of traitors, my friend, I said. Those who have been chewed up and spit out by war. I touched the scars. And those who sent several thousand men to the enemy's meat-packing plant. I was spit out by the war, and you're still there. We shut down and destroyed that base, the Eulerian said behind my back. There is a branch of the temple there now. His daughter found this information in the family archives and gave it to us, another alien said. She was the one who offered to put a temple here. It was a legal transaction. He transferred ownership rights to Nieta. Terran, you surprise me, I said. Why would you keep something like that? Sentimentality? Terran was silent. You were right to hire me. You were sure I'd get information from the Eulerians and guide your goons here. And you weren't wrong. I am indeed the best. You hired me to keep your daughter safe. And if the main danger to her is her father, a murderer and a war criminal. We have special facilities, the older Eulerian said, and a separate program for humans. But if you want to turn him over to the Federation authorities, I shook my head. It's been too long. Yes, he will go to court. Perhaps even found guilty, but he'll pay it off. This is where he belongs. Just keep him away from Nieta. Of course, the Eulerian said. This way, the benefit will be best served. I turned so I wouldn't see Terran again. He made me sick to my stomach. You can stay too, the Eulerian said after me. It would serve you good to become a discarnate. The temple accepts everyone. I glanced over my shoulder with a grin. The temptation is considerable, I said. But I have unfinished work to do back home. And the thing is that when I'm paid, I always see the job through.